So as you know, we've been having these biblical roundtables coming from The Chosen season 4. Well, technically season 3 as they're kind of going through all the episodes. Now they're finally on episode 4, which is kind of like the most boring episode of all of season 2. It's an okay episode, but it's definitely a setup episode. Probably my least favorite out of the whole season from season 3. And, but anyway, overall, still a good episode. A lot of things to talk about here biblically. And so the roundtable kind of dives into some of these different subjects. The first one that we're going to talk about is actually celibacy and how that works out in Christian life. Who should be celibate? Who's called to that? What does marriage look like? What is the benefits of marriage? All of that kind of stuff. They talk about this, and I love the way that Rabbi Jason Sobel and the other Bible roundtable people talk about these issues. It's always cool to hear other people that love Scripture and love the Bible talk about issues that you care about. So let's dive into this and talk about this one. Here we go.
Before that takes place, though, in fact, it's taking place while Simon and Eden are in tension. And a couple things about this that I wanted to unpack briefly, which is, number one, we talked about this in a previous roundtable earlier this season, which is the idea of marriage, and that there are some people in the Catholic faith who believe that even the apostles, the early apostles, weren't married because they were so focused on the ministry. And in fact, I saw a video where they were talking about this particular sequence when Simon comes home and there's tension. Now, this was loosely based on almost every marriage I've ever seen, and my marriage that I've experienced in, we call it re-entry. When one of the spouses has been gone for a time, they come back, and the expectations are grand, and it's going to be, we've been missing each other. It's going to be so great.
Yeah, this happens to me and Vanessa all the time. Like last week when I got back from youth camp, it was actually pretty good. Like that was one of the times when we didn't really like fight or like anything happened. But before, like we've definitely had things where I've been gone for a while or she's been gone for a while, and then we get back and it's like almost every single time we end up like fighting or like going through, like issues just because, expectations aren't met. Right. And so it's really, really, really relatable for sure.
Great. And almost invariably, it doesn't live up to expectations, and there's tension. And Simon comes home, and he's wanting to nap right away. He's wanting to have guys over the next day, and Eden's kind of hoping he comes in as a hero, and immediately that they get to talk or that he gets to be helpful, and none of that took place. So one of the video that I saw said, see, this is why in ministry it's better to not be married. Because Simon's off doing all these great ministerial things, and now he's got to deal with this tension at home. Share what the church tradition is about when celibacy began. Is there a predominant belief that the apostles themselves weren't married? I mean, I know you would say highly unlikely. Back then, marriage was extremely important and would have been very, very rare and probably mentioned in Scripture if they weren't married. Paul mentioned himself as not being married. You'd think he would have mentioned the apostles as well if they weren't.
Jesus does when he talks about some don't marry for the sake of the kingdom. Right. So there's the notion would be that there's a tradition of celibate chastity that goes back to the time of Jesus and before. Qumran and some of the other communities around there would have practiced that.
So this is really interesting. Now, this is actually to bring it back to a kind of different point. This is like, so when we were in Israel last time, we actually had some teachers that went with us. And one of the teachers that was teaching at Qumran actually made this statement as well, talking exactly about what this priest is talking about here, how there could have been things going back to Qumran where the people here were chaste, basically, like they didn't have wives. Now, our guide, who was a Jewish, Messianic Jewish, believer, she was like, no. Like, she was a lot like Rabbi Jason Sobel, where she's like, nah, like, you don't understand Jewish culture. Like, there's no way that was the case. And so it's funny that he brings that up as well, because there was a quick moment when we were kind of like correcting ourselves or like, fighting over this small issue. It's like really interesting. But from a Jewish point of view, like this is like very, very unlikely. And it is crazy to me to see the dichotomy of the Catholics believing so hard in one direction and then the Jewish belief being so hard in the other, Jewish culture being so hard in the other. Real quick, if you want to join us on our next Israel trip, you can join us in January of 2024. This is going to be an awesome trip with Isaac David, who runs Daily Disciple, and John McRae, who runs What Do You Meme here on YouTube. They're amazing content creators, but they're also very smart biblically. So I'm excited for this trip, getting to learn from them and just to meet you all. So if you want to come on that trip, all the details are in the link in the description down below. Anyway, let's get back to the video.
That's continued in the New Testament for a lot of cultural reasons and other reasons. The practice was common among clergy in the Catholic Church, but not required till the 10th or 11th century. Mm-hmm. And there's really mixed reasons, from very practical to theological, that it was made. So then part of the reason then was spiritual and being available for Christ. Part of it was they didn't know what to do with the kids of bishops, and how in the inheritance of property, and how the resources of a ministry or church are shared with children. And so there's lots of complicated things, certainly a lot of them spiritual, and there's a whole theology and spirituality of celibacy today. But I don't think there's anything anyone in the church that studied that would say that Peter wasn't married. He clearly was married, and the possibility that his wife accompanied him on more of his journeys. Mm-hmm. The last two popes that we've had have really tried to encourage theological reflection on the Christian mission of marriage that married couples have together. Right. But we're so in the tradition of celibacy is so great, and I think there's a lot of value to it. Mm-hmm. But it's been at some points, and I suppose this will be troubling for some people that I'm saying this, at some point the emphasis on celibacy has been to the underdevelopment of a spirituality of marriage in mission. And
yeah, I could definitely see that. I know like in that circle, like especially if you're a priest, like how do you manage that, right? And how do you teach on marriage never having been married? Like that would be very difficult. Yeah, it's really an interesting thing that I've never been part of that culture for sure. So I feel like it would be extremely, extremely difficult.
And that's all coming to be now.
Yeah, I mean, in evangelical tradition, whether it's missionaries or pastors and wives, mm-hmm. or I mean, you're a teacher, but I mean, mm-hmm. marriage is looked at as an additive, and I understand the celibacy thing, and Paul obviously wrote about it. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think if you overcorrect and deny the value that marriage can have, even in ministry and in mm-hmm. missions and in having children too, that can be an additive part of ministry. I know that
So what Dallas is actually talking about there, before we get too far, he's actually talking about how Paul talks about this in Scripture. So what Paul says is that basically it's better for you to be single. Like if you can, stay single, because you'll be able to do more for Christ, essentially. But then he says if you're burning up with passion, then like get married, obviously, so that you're not burning up with passion and lust and all of that stuff. But there's also verses in Scripture that show us that marriage is an additive thing, right? That it is a beneficial thing for your life and how you operate. And in my life, that's very much the case. I was not called to singleness. For me, Vanessa has made me by far a better person than I ever could have been, because she brings me to the feet of Christ over and over and over again. And so for her and me, like it's been such an additive experience being together. While we know that maybe if we were single, there would be very specific things that we could do better if we were single. For the most part, everything that I do is better because Vanessa's in my life. And so that is a huge, huge part of my life and where God has brought me, right? And so we have to talk about that in both senses for sure.
In my work, I'm not a minister, but my wife is very involved in that, but also our children, like we try to participate them or include them in as a family in terms of what it is that we're doing, even though I'm the one who's traveling more, or I'm the one who's actually doing most of that particular work. I'm actually renewed and re-energized by my wife and kids at times. So I think as always, finding or trying to avoid the extremes of saying that, well, marriage means that you can't do ministry, or ministry means you can't be married.
Absolutely, a lot of it's call. Like, I've certainly made peace with celibacy and even really come to embrace it. And I don't know that I would have been able to make it work to, to have a family.
Interesting.
I would have certainly have to do things differently than I do them now. And I think I would have had problems, but I totally respect that there are people that do make it work.
Oh, I think naturally, marriage is sacrifice. So of course, like there would be huge differences that you'd have to make in your life in order to live that life. Of course, definitely would change a ton of things for sure. And great examples even within the Catholic Church. I had a mentor who was a monk, left, and then after he left, he got married. And first of all, he went to Africa and ran a school in Africa. Came back, met a woman, and but they decided to go back to Africa for 2 years together because it was important for her to understand the mission that had been so important part of it. And they did incredible work together. And that's always been an example to me of another way that was possible that I could have chosen.
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate that. I have used a tongue twister with some students. Marriage must match mission. It's hard to say that fast. But yeah, we do have missions that we're called to. And that doesn't mean it's in opposition to marriage, but you certainly want your marriage partner to have a likewise calling to that mission so that your marriage will not suffer. That doesn't mean it's problem-free, and that's what I appreciate about Simon and Eden's relationship in this episode, in this season, is they're figuring that out. What do we have a marriage match with our mission? And how do we communicate about that, much less carry it out? It's a real thing for couples to be contemplating.
And I think it's significant because I think when you look at what is the government of heaven, the government of heaven is...
And this is really where the Jewish perspective kind of comes in, because he brings in like this understanding from a Jewish perspective that everything is built on this marriage idea. Like even Jesus coming back, like yes, he wasn't married on earth, but like yes, he is married. Like we are betrothed. Like the church is betrothed to Jesus. And so that marriage is definitely a real thing, right? Like it's definitely a big part of Scripture. And so not saying that nobody in the world is ever going to be celibate and called to that. I think that Paul clearly talks about that there are people that are called to that life. But I think in general, that's the exception to the rule. It is not a normal thing, even within church leadership. I would say very much so. So, yeah. Like, for example, it talks about elders in the church and everything else, like having wives and how they interacted with their wives and their children and everything else. So I think it's a big part of what God designed in general, right? Be fruitful and multiply, and all of that kind of comes into play as well.
It's family, right? Even within the Godhead, it's portrayed as a family. When God makes man and then he makes woman, it says, man and woman are made in his image and likeness. He made them. So it's not the man or the husband by himself or the woman or wife by herself, but together they reflect the how heaven works in relationship and in family. And so I think that's important. And I think, again, even the struggle, which is, I love, this is, the chosen is very real, and I would say, in a sense, marriage is sandpaper for the soul, right? It's meant to smooth out the rough edges in one another. I know I'm better, for as a result of it, right? I mean, it does something to you, and a selflessness of having to take care of children and balance all of the different tensions within relationships. So
you're saying Father Guffey has rough edges that haven't been
but I live in community, and I've never lived alone. I've always lived with other people, and there's
That's probably extremely important as a priest, like to live in community besides just yourself, because I can imagine it'd be way easier to fall into sin if you're just living on your own, right? Bringing people home or, getting into lust and pornography or whatever else, right? Like it'd be way easier to get into all of that if you're just living on your own. Not that I'm sure they don't. I'm sure that there's many priests in the world that still sin in that way and figure ways around it, but to be in a community like that would be very necessary, very, very necessary.
All the tensions and none of the other benefits. But you're right. We're not made to do this alone. And so the great challenge of anybody that feels called to celibacy is you have to be radically open to other kinds of relationship, or it's problematic and. It can be problematic, and it may not be a genuine call.
Yeah, I think marriage overall is really, really important, right? I think that in my life especially, it has been something that has made me who I am in a lot of ways. Obviously, completely changed my life and changed the way that I think about things and how I interact with Vanessa and all of it. But I don't think that everybody's called to that. But at the same time, I do think it's something that God designed for a specific purpose in order to teach us something as well. So, thank you so much for checking out this small part of our live stream. You can check out the entire live stream and full podcasts over on our Patreon at patreon.com/thesnipelife. This is by far the best way to help us in our ministry. So thank you so much to those that are on our Patreon already. And we'll see the rest of you over there, hopefully. We'd love to hit 300 patrons this year, so you could really, really help us out. We're just about to hit 200. Anyway, we'll see you on the next one. Peace.